Hi everyone, nice to have you all here today and welcome. So I'm Isabel and I work in the policy team at RSPB Scotland. I guess first off, we just wanted to thank all of you for coming along today because we know there's so much going on at the moment with COP. So we really appreciate you finding some time to come along and hear about the Nature Recovery Plan. And we know that that's why it's maybe a small and select but very good group of people that we've got here today. And we're going to be sharing the recording with various other folks so that we can spread some of the messages that we'll be talking about today. So first off, I'm just going to present some background around why we felt we needed to develop the Nature Recovery Plan and also give a brief overview of the plan, which we published last year. And then I'll hand over to Bruce, who's going to talk about what progress we've made over the last year towards achieving some of the 11 actions that are set out in the plan and also where we need to go from here. So whilst COP26 is obviously first and foremost about the climate emergency, we mustn't forget that we're also facing a nature emergency, an ecological crisis that is deeply interlinked with the climate crisis, and that these two crises must be tackled as one. We know that nature is being lost around the world faster than ever, and actually Scotland is a country that is world famous for its wildlife and landscapes. So it can be quite hard for people to look out at some of our amazing wild places and comprehend that actually nature is not well. This is partly because, like with climate change, many of the aspects of the nature crisis are not visible to people, and partly also because our reference points for nature and how healthy our nature is are what we've seen within our own lifetimes. And this means that each new generation comes to see a degraded environment as a new baseline or as a new normal. And this is known as shifting baseline syndrome. But in fact, actually new research has found Scotland to be one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. The Biodiversity Intactness Index is a measure developed by the Natural History Museum and estimates biodiversity loss across an area using a combination of land use, other human pressures and species abundance data to give us a simple figure for biodiversity intactness. In simple terms, this is basically telling us how much nature is left from what would have been a pristine state. By this measure, Scotland was assessed as coming 212th out of 240 countries and territories, or 28th from the bottom, on how intact our biodiversity remains today. But as you can see from the chart on the slides, actually the situation in Scotland isn't as bad as it is in some of the other UK countries. And we know we're still losing nature now, although a lot of the loss of nature that the Biodiversity Intactness Index highlights is historical. The State of Nature Scotland report looks at more recent trends, and this was published in 2019 by NGOs and government agencies. And it found that since 1970, half of our species in Scotland have declined, with one in nine at risk of national extinction from Scotland. But all is not gloomy and all is not lost. Whilst much of our biodiversity is in trouble, we still have the staggering beauty of our pine woods and peatlands, our eagles, dolphins, bumblebees, salmon, kelp, orchids, curlews, and thousands of other precious species. And I think that what the Biodiversity Intactness Index helps show us is how much we have to regain at the start of this UN decade on ecosystem restoration, and that all we need is the collective will and action to make it happen. We also know that restoring nature can be a huge part of the climate solution, as restoring habitats like peatlands, native woodlands, coastal habitats, and our oceans to a healthy state will help to lock up carbon, as well as helping wildlife to thrive. So it's vital that the role of nature restoration is given the attention it deserves at COP26, and that this results in strong global commitments to protect carbon-rich habitats. But we're also looking ahead to another important international conference, COP15 of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is going to happen next May in China. So whilst this COP in Glasgow has been focused on a new global framework for climate, COP15 will focus on a new international framework for nature. And to explain the links between the two COPs in a bit more detail and what we want to see across the UK countries, I'm just going to play a short video from Environment Links UK, which is a group of environmental coalitions working together to ramp up national and international ambition on nature.
I don't think the sound's playing, Isabel.
Let me try again.
You may already know that vital global climate talks are being held in Glasgow this year, but did you know that this is also a crucial year to strike a new global deal to save nature?
Our natural world is our life support system. Helping nature recover is vital for our health and well-being, jobs in the economy, and for climate. On land and seas, our natural world is being pushed to the edge by the effects of human activity and climate change.
Nature and climate are often discussed separately, but in reality, they're inextricably linked. In our oceans, a great whale can store 20 times more carbon than a car emits every year. And seagrass can capture 35 times more carbon than rainforest. Trees capture carbon and tackle flooding, reducing runoff by as much as 80%. The truth is that we can't tackle the climate emergency without protecting nature.
New international deals to restore our natural world and climate must be matched by domestic action. We need legally binding targets to halt nature's decline in all 4 UK nations, with the funding and enforcement to back them up in order to turn the tide for nature by 2030. That's why we need leaders across the UK and around the world to tackle the climate and nature crises together.
You may.
So where are we at in Scotland in terms of tackling these crises together? Well, there's been recent positive recognition by the Scottish Government that this needs to happen, but we do still have a long way to go. We can also learn a lot from the kind of action that's been taken over the last few years to tackle climate change, as we're seeing now how ambitious and legally binding targets accompanied by a delivery plan is helping to drive cross-sector action to achieve net zero by providing a shared goal. And we need to see similar urgency and ambition on nature loss. It's therefore hugely positive that the Scottish Government recently committed to bring forward legally binding targets for nature's recovery, with an overarching goal of preventing any further extinctions of wildlife and halting declines in nature by 2030, and making significant progress in restoring Scotland's natural environment by 2045. These targets will be included in a natural environment bill that's scheduled to come forward towards the end of this Parliament, but we're hoping that we can work with the Scottish Government to develop these targets so that it can be brought forward even sooner. We, of course, also have a new political context in Scotland since the parliamentary election earlier this year, with a new cooperation agreement between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Party, and a new Green Party Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Biodiversity, Lorna Slater. And this new government, as I said, has made positive indications that tackling the twin crises together and restoring nature is a priority over the next 5 years. For example, just last week, we saw the kind of launch of a permanent nature restoration fund, and this is hugely welcome. So we know that targets are going to be brought forward, but what policies and actions would be needed in order to meet those targets? Well, last year, RSPB Scotland, Scottish Wildlife Trust and WWF Scotland joined together to publish a nature recovery plan. This is a set of 11 transformative actions that would put nature on a pathway to recovery in Scotland. And this report was supported by 22 other environmental charities. So the 11 actions, which you can see down the side here, cover land and sea, from a whole range of topics such as how we farm to how we prevent the spread of invasive non-native species. And the actions were designed to tackle the 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss, which are changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasive non-native species. We know that addressing these main drivers will have the biggest benefits for nature. And we tried to be specific and deliverable in designing the actions, and also have highlighted the widespread benefits that delivering these actions would create for people. Things like cleaning up our air and drinking water, improving health and well-being, and ultimately our quality of life. This would also help to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in Scotland and tackle inequalities by ensuring that all people in Scotland have access to nature-rich spaces. We also know that investing in nature recovery and restoration can create nature-based jobs. So we did some research earlier this year into the job creation potential of our nature recovery plan, and we found that investment in 5 areas in particular would strongly contribute to a green recovery from COVID-19 in Scotland. These are restoring and expanding native woodlands, managing deer populations, delivering a Scottish nature network, restoring peatlands, and supporting climate and nature-friendly farming. Our estimates show that investing in just these 5 areas have the potential to create over 7,000 direct and indirect jobs across Scotland over the next 10 years. And given this is just a snapshot of actions, indicates that there's even bigger potential for the nature sector as a whole. This is vital because we know that we need a just transition for many nature-dependent sectors and rural economies, such as agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. And a just transition really means moving to a net zero and nature-rich economy in a way that's fair for everyone, including people working in industries that need to end or change to be more sustainable. Some of these sectors we know are very much at the forefront of the nature and climate crises because they're very dependent on nature, and will most acutely feel the impacts of things like temperature rise and more extreme weather events. But we also know they have a huge role to play in contributing solutions to these crises. So a green and just recovery in Scotland should start to not only increase and grow the nature sector by creating new jobs and skills in restoring and protecting nature, but also by starting to provide the support that existing sectors will need to transition to a net zero and nature-rich economy. So just quickly, I'd like to give a few examples of what some of these jobs would actually be. So one of the actions we've highlighted is helping agriculture to be more nature and climate friendly, something we know is critical for reversing the loss of biodiversity. And in order to do that, one thing we need is a scaling up of the existing rural advice scheme, as there's a need for more people on the ground to provide quality tailored advice to farmers, crofters and land managers about reducing emissions and helping to support more nature. So these are roles that would not only help to facilitate that kind of wider transition that I was just talking about, but also in itself would create several hundred jobs across Scotland. Another area where there's strong potential for job creation is in peatland restoration. So peatlands are one of our biggest natural assets as they support important wildlife, but also store large amounts of carbon when they're healthy. Sadly, at the moment, around 80% of peatlands in Scotland are degraded, meaning they're currently emitting carbon. So there's a huge challenge ahead to restore all of Scotland's peatlands, but this is also an opportunity as it will require skilled workers such as ecologists to do surveys and skilled contractors to carry out restoration work. Similarly, there would be jobs in native woodland expansion, another key action for nature and climate, specialist roles in woodland management, restoration and expansion. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of what the Nature Recovery Plan is all about. And now I'll pass over to Bruce, who's going to look at some of the progress we've made achieving the 11 actions over the last year.
Thanks very much, Isabel. Yeah, as Isabel said, we wanted to use this chance provided by COP to kind of highlight the importance of nature-based solutions, and some of the things that are included in this plan are obviously directly nature-based solutions to the climate emergency, but all the other problems we face as society as well, and then use that to look forward to the Biodiversity COP15 in Kunming in China as well next year. We've come up with a very non-scientific, non-technical finger in the air discussion between WWF, RSPB and Scottish Wildlife Trust to come up with this scoring system. So that's much further to go, on our way, nearly there and met. We're happy to debate any of these at the end. If anyone's got any strong feelings that we've misscored, this is just an exercise to highlight the progress we think we've made so far. Right, so on to the actions. Number one was deliver a significant expansion in Scotland's native woodlands annually from 2020. We've decided to score this as much further to go because we've not seen enough progress on native woodland targets to meet our ask of 50% of new planting to be native species. We're currently on track for about 4,000 hectares of native planting. To achieve 50%, we'd want to see 9,000 hectares planted by 2025. So quite a way to go there. But we are pleased to see recent commitments in the PFG and other places around Scotland's expanding Scotland's rainforest. This is a really important habitat in Scotland, and it's one that all our organisations and other Scottish Environment Link organisations are very keen to see protected and enhanced. Number two was introduce new legislation to achieve sustainable low impact fishing by the end of 2021. We've scored this one as much further to go as well. Neither Isabel or myself are marine experts, so we've consulted with some of our colleagues on this one. They've told us there's been some welcome commitments, some steps in the right direction. So fisheries will be managed to the best available scientific evidence and advice. There's been welcome commitments to progress the introduction of remote electronic monitoring on fishing vessels, and there's been some progress towards climate smart fisheries strategy. But there's still a long way to go and no clear specific commitments to new legislation, which is what we really want to see. We really need to move more quickly in this area. As we saw from the video, our marine habitats have a massive potential to help when it comes to climate change. So we do need to work on that a little bit more quickly. Number three, implement licensing of driven grouse shooting by the end of 2021. And we've marked that as on our way. It's very welcome that since the Werity review, the Scottish Government is committed to tackle wildlife crime and to address the environmental impacts of intensive grouse moor management and to support the transition to a more economically and environmentally productive use of the land. And it's also said that where appropriate, it will deliver the recommendations of the grouse moor management group. And it will do this as a matter of urgency. Licensing should cover the key areas identified in the review. And those are, I think, moor burn, wildlife control, the use of medicated grit, and a look at wildlife crime. The next one on our list was reducing deer populations and maintaining them at sustainable levels through new or improved legislation by the end of 2021. Again, we've said on our way with this one. It's quite similar to driven grouse moor licensing. There's quite a lot of policy work done around this area. And some very welcome commitments have been made to implement the recommendations of the Deer Management Working Group, including introducing new cull return system, ensuring proportionate deer management plans, modernising the existing legislation, including deer closed seasons, and the use of specialist equipment when managing deer. I think what else do I want to cover in that one? I think, yeah, the main message there is that there's been some great commitments made, but we need to see that move forward. And it's interesting to look at this one with the kind of interlinkages between all our different asks. Advancing our deer nature recovery plan ask will really help massively with our native woodland expansion target, which in turn will help create a more coherent national nature network. So they're all interlinked. Our next ask on the list would be to ensure that all new development is net positive for nature through the National Performance Framework in 2022. Given this only came out a few days ago, I've barely had time to skim it, but there's been some positive commitments in there towards net positive for nature, and there's specific wording in the National Planning Framework. Sorry, I think I might have called it National Performance Framework earlier. Sorry, National Planning Framework. That development proposals should contribute to the enhancement of biodiversity, including restoring degraded habitats and building and strengthening nature networks and the connections between them. Should is a lovely word, but environment NGOs have had trouble with this word in planning documents before. Should quite often gets translated to nice to have and then dropped further down the line. So we really want to see some strengthening around the words there. We're also slightly concerned around metrics that will be used to assess this kind of form of net gain and how that will be kind of fair across different areas of Scotland. So there's quite a lot of work to do there, but we're pleased with the commitment. And next slide, please, Isabel. That's all right. So Scottish Nature Network, my big the one that I like to champion most out of all of these asks. Environment NGOs in Scotland are kind of all behind this idea of a Scottish Nature Network, and we asked for Scottish Nature Network to be included within NPF4 and be delivered by 2030. So this one is much further to go. There's some lovely wordings around nature networks in the NPF4, but from a quick skim, we can see nothing specific that would actually constitute a strategic, holistic approach to planning where our green and blue infrastructure goes in the landscape. We had a previous commitment in the last planning framework and in the last Scottish Biodiversity to deliver something called a national ecological network. We had zero movement on that. And I tell you, looking at green recovery from COVID, it would have been really nice to have a system where we could use opportunity mapping to look at investments in our natural capital and green infrastructure to deliver some of the green jobs that Isabel was talking about, and the obvious climate and biodiversity benefits that we need to combat the nature and climate emergencies. We don't have that, and we urgently need to move on with it. Number 7 was end burning on peatland and the commercial extraction and sale of peat for horticulture across Scotland by 2023. And we have said we're on our way here. We're pleased at some of the progress. This is an action where we've been seeing some really positive recent comments, but we now need to see that followed up with strong delivery. The PFG, sorry, I'll stop using acronyms all the time, Programme for Government committed to introduce legislation to licence muir burn and to take forward work to develop and consult on a ban on the sale of peat and related gardening products, and also a commitment to phase out the use of peat in horticulture. These are, like, we're really encouraged by this, and this is the sort of thing that we've been working across NGOs in Scotland for a long time. There's obvious biodiversity and a climate benefit from this, but we really need to see a timeline for these commitments now. We also need to see more funding for peatland restoration. The multi-annual commitment of 250 million over 10 years is, again, really welcome, a real step in the right direction. But we know that ultimately it will not be good enough to fund the restoration of all of Scotland's peatland, which will be critical for climate targets. And when our nature targets come online as well, it'll also be critical for that. So let's get a jump on it now and start moving in the right direction. Number 8 was introduce and apply new rules to improve the use of nitrogen by 2024. Again, I'd say this is on our way. Some really good progress that we welcome. The nitrogen balance sheet is under development, and that's generally got support, I think, from the industry as well. New funding's been announced to support nitrogen budgets on farms. There's been really good discussions around things like whole farm reviews being part of the replacement for the Common Agricultural Policy as well. So that is positive, but it does still feel quite a long way away. We need to progress that a bit more rapidly. So yeah, a little bit more action needed there, but we're pleased that we're on our way. Number 9 was establish a Scottish invasive non-native species inspectorate by 2025, and unfortunately this one we're going to have to mark as much further to go, which is a new category I've just invented. It should be much further to go. Disappointingly, there's been little progress on this issue. It feels like it's had a pretty low profile compared to other issues that we've talked about today, but that's despite it being identified as one of the top 5 drivers of biodiversity loss globally. We've had Nature Scot acknowledge how much of a problem this is, and we can see direct impacts of things like ash dieback. On my little walk pre-work this morning, I saw pretty much every ash tree that I passed was suffering. So if we think of just simply the economic cost of the local authority having to deal with that, or your local RSPB, Wildlife Trust, National Trust, all these different organisations, that's just a tiny flavour of how much economic impact that has, never mind the biodiversity and climate impact of those things. So we need to get in on top of invasive non-natives, and we've seen very, very little action on that. So that's, yeah, that does need a lot of work. Number 10, transform Scottish agricultural policy by 2027 so that it facilitates and rewards nature and climate-friendly farming. We've put this as much further to go, but it was a little bit of a tough call because there's been some great progress recently. We do want to praise the announcement that the Agri-Environment Agri-Climate Scheme, not EECS as I want to call it, I'll not use the initialism, will be reopened and run until 2024. There's a commitment to consult on future agricultural bills, and indeed there's a big consultation out at the moment. They're going to be setting out a vision for more thinking in the agriculture area, particularly looking at how farmers will help deal with the nature and climate emergency. There's also a kind of a commitment. I'm just trying to think my way back into the programme for government wording that 50% of direct payments will be conditional in the future, which is hugely welcome. But the problem there being that 50% of all payments will not be conditional and will not be delivering against climate and the climate and nature emergency. We're hopeful that will mean the 50% that are conditional will be doing a lot to tackle nature and climate emergencies. It won't simply just be regulatory baseline. So we do feel like there's quite a way to go there, considering around about 80% of our land is under some form of 75 to 8% of some form of agricultural management. It is really important for nature and climate that we help farmers do the best for tackling the crisis and also feeling positive about the actions that they're bringing about on farm. I think that was number 10, Isabel. Yeah, it was number 10. And in number 11, the final one is commit to at least 30% of Scotland's seas being highly protected, with at least 10% fully protected by 2023. And I think for this one, we've said on our way. There's been some welcome progress in some areas. So what we need to do now is ensure the MPA network Marine Protected Area Network is effectively managed for nature. We've welcomed all of our organisations, the ambitious ambitions to protect at least 10% of Scotland's seas from all destructive and extractive activity as highly protected marine areas, which are HPMAs, again following these initialisms, by 2026, and introduce fisheries management by 2024. But we need to ensure the entire network is protected from damaging activity as per commonly accepted international standards. So I've sort of flown through all of them. We're happy to discuss them. Oh, thanks, Isabel. But in summary, there's been some really great progress and more progress in the last little while than we've had in maybe the past few years. So we are pleased and do want to welcome that. We don't want to be too doom and gloom about it, but we do want to be realistic about this. We're in a nature and climate emergency. If we have the chance now to look back, and kind of predict where we'd be with our climate, our kind of ambitions around climate, how we've transformed the way we view it. It's the main news item on BBC, Sky, ITV at the moment. If we could have a little bit of that forethought around nature, that would be fantastic. And if we can get a jump on it now, the cost, the difficulty of tackling our nature emergency will not be anywhere near as much as if we delay things as much as we have with climate change. We really need to focus heavily on delivery and implementation, and that's been an issue. We're used to in Scotland, high level messaging around nature is actually very good. Tackling the implementation gap is now where we need to look, and we need to take the opportunity of the UN's decade of ecosystem restoration to move things forward, and let's use COP26 in Glasgow and follow on the Biodiversity COP in China as a real the impetus behind that. So what we want to see over this next 9 to 12 months, a real focus on native woodland expansion, really getting to grips with agricultural transformation, making sure that we get that right. A focus on legislation for driven grouse moor licensing, year burn and deer management, and then a kind of medium-term focus on developing what we've called a Scottish nature network, but just a more holistic view of how we plan and implement our green and blue infrastructure in the landscape to deliver the nature-based solutions that we need. That's going to require coordination of funding, action plans, timelines, cross-sectoral working, and just transition plans. And just a note on just transition, it's something that's being talked about increasingly, and that's fantastic. Justice is very important here, but there's two key words within just transition. One's the justice part of it, but we do need to transition to a different way of doing things, and currently the pace of change is not enough. So that's probably the last note I'll leave on there. Any questions or discussion points?
Thanks, Bruce. I'll just stop sharing and pass back to Nick.
Well, thank you both for that. That was fantastic. So if you do have any questions, if you could possibly just pop them into the chat. I think it was a pretty comprehensive presentation from both of you. So I don't know if anyone does have any questions, but is there what we can also do is if no one wants to give any questions now, we can also give out any details to the people to maybe get in touch with both of you. So if you guys want to pop the email address in the chat, that would be fantastic. I'm just waiting to see if anyone is typing.
Nick, could I just say that we talked about agriculture just there. You may or may not wish to respond to the current Scottish Government agricultural consultation. Scottish Environment Link have got a kind of an answer to every question that's in the current agricultural consultation. So you could look at that and see what that says. And if you want to, you can submit your own consultation response as well. I'll quickly try and find the link just in case anyone's interested.
So got one question there from Chris so far, which I can go to either of you, which is there going to be sufficient funding to deliver our ambitions? So I don't know if Bruce, if you or Isabel.
I can kick that off if you want, Bruce, and then I'm sure you'll have some points to add. Excellent question from Chris. I mean, we all know that funding has been a major lack of sufficient funding has been a major barrier to kind of kicking off ecosystem restoration projects at the scale that we need. And I think it's clear that there is a huge funding gap. I mean, a recent report from the Green Finance Institute estimated the funding needed for protecting and restoring Scotland's biodiversity to be about £8 billion. At that scale, what's clear is that there needs to be a mixture of funding sources coming in. So we absolutely need to see increased public investment and also repurposing of existing public spend to deliver more for nature. But clearly, we're also going to need to leverage more private investment. And there's kind of lots of conversations going on at the moment about how that can be achieved. And Bruce, I know you've been particularly working on some of that, so I don't know if you'd like to add some thoughts.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said there, and I think you're particularly right to highlight the report which highlighting the gap. I'm convinced that we need more private sector funding in here, and I don't think there's many people who disagree with that. There is a massively important role for government though, because there's real potential to get it wrong if we don't approach private sector funding properly. As NGOs, we've called, as I said, for a long time for more strategic thinking around the environment. We'd like to see a Scottish Nature Network that uses opportunity mapping to highlight the places that we need our green and blue infrastructure, not only for biodiversity, to provide all of the other benefits that we need from nature. If we had that, it would be far easier to maybe invest agricultural spend, so encouraging farmers to do the right thing, maybe dovetailing that with money from investors who might want to help do the right thing, or work that NGOs are doing. So they're all pulling in the same direction. And I think without that strategic thinking, we're not going to, it won't, some of its parts won't be as great as the equal parts that are going in. Does that make sense? Yeah, we basically need more holistic thinking there, and the Scottish Nature Network is a very good way to contribute that.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, both. Oh,
sorry, Nick, can I just add one more thought on that? Because this is such an important topic. I mean, this is really going to be the focus of a lot of our work, I think, over the next year, is how can we generate enough funding to support the delivery. I mean, I noticed that Brian's also mentioned this issue of leveraging private sector investment in the chat. So the short answer is yes, we absolutely need it. There needs to be cross-sector working to investigate how best to deliver that. But I think we see a strong role for government in sending signals to the private sector that this is an area of priority investment. And part of that is investing in a few kind of key areas itself. The Nature Restoration Fund that was announced last week is hugely welcome, as I said earlier. And I think that the commitment is currently 55 million over the next 5 years. That's a brilliant start. It'll get loads of projects off the ground, but ultimately we know that it's not going to be enough to achieve the scale of change needed. So we're hoping to see that fund kind of transformed and scaled up into a large scale delivery fund over the next 5 to 10 years.
Agreed.
Thanks as well. We've had a few more questions come in. So you said that besides funding, we need staff resources. It's unrealistic to assume that we get many more staff in a hurry. To tackle these big priorities, what do we need to drop to create the capacity we need?
What a great question. I think overstretch in small environmental NGOs is an almost constant question to be kicked around. It's certainly a big problem in the industry. We were all just comparing how much overtime we've built up during COP alone in the last few weeks, never mind over our lifetimes. There's definitely a big problem with overstretch. There's a huge amount to be done. But the one thing I would suggest is, let's please not waste the time of NGOs. Everyone, all of the RSPB, WWF and Scottish Wildlife Trust spent huge amount of time over the last few years planning applications for designated sites. One in particular, Cool Links, a triple designated site, so designated at a UK level, designated at a European level, and designated at an international level. The amount of resource and time of our policy and expert staff devoted to that, and fundraising that we had to perform to help fight that development. Designated sites need, in a nature and climate emergency, need to remain designated sites. That is a complete waste of time and resource, and I really don't want to have to deal with anything like that again. They must be protected unless there's an overwhelming national need. So that is definitely something that we need to do less of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, Bruce. I think definitely part of it is kind of trying to collectively focus on positive change rather than trying to stop bad things from happening. But I think there's other things that can be done as well, such as, I mean, Bruce has spoken a lot about this need for kind of a strategic vision for Scotland's land through a nature network. I think that the upcoming Scottish Biodiversity strategy is a brilliant opportunity to try and get collective, like cross-sector agreement about what some big projects that we could all deliver over the next 10 years, because the more we're aligned on outcomes and projects, the more we can kind of make efficient use of all of our time together and maximize that collective effort. Another thing that we're kind of interested in exploring at the moment, potentially trying to kind of influence the upcoming budget to secure, is a bit of sort of accelerator funding for the environment sector to help develop the skills and capacity that the sector's going to need to develop on a lot of these priorities over the next 10 years. So if we are going to be looking at like more private sector money coming in for ecosystem restoration, we need to make sure that there's enough skilled workers to actually pick up some of that work. There's some good kind of initiatives that the Scottish Government have kicked off around green skills, but I think quite a lot of it is focused on climate, and I know that there is work to develop a kind of nature jobs action plan, which is brilliant. So hopefully that will kind of provide a bit of a blueprint for moving some of that conversation on over the next year. But I think that that's really important to kind of build more resilience into the sector. Oh, you're on mute, Nick.
I would have thought I got past that by now, but apparently not. So a few more questions have come in. So Chris has asked, what has the devolved government's responses been to the Biodiversity and Happiness Index?
Do you want me to pick that one up, Bruce?
Yeah, if that's all right, I'm just trying to scroll to that question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the BII was published by the Natural History Museum, as I said, earlier this year, and recently the Scottish Government kind of acknowledged that this is a really important part of our shared evidence base. So I think it now forms kind of this shared evidence base along with the State of Nature report that I also mentioned, and some of the biodiversity indicators that the Scottish Government has under its national performance framework. So I think all of these kind of data sources together help to piece together a bigger picture about what the state of nature used to be and where we are with trends now. And I think it's also been adopted by the CBD and IPBES as a kind of critical global measure of nature loss. So yeah, it seems to be forming an important part of our understanding.
Perfect. And Brian's come back in with another question, which is, what role do you see our existing protected areas and work to deliver the 30% of Scotland in areas protected for nature play in delivering the nature network? Sorry, that was, I don't know if I read that correctly.
Yeah,
I think I did.
I think I get the gist of that, yeah. Massively important. We kind of see existing protected areas as the nodes of a Scottish nature network. So they're the the really important places, and it's the wider landscape that we need to use to connect those places up, so that we're it's kind of fairly basic theory of island biogeography stuff, but we need to make sure that we're allowing those connections to happen across the landscape. So we see them as hugely important. And I think I noticed another question coming as well, which was actually, is it not wishful thinking to think that protected sites are sacrosanct? Well, I hope not. Otherwise, what is the point in protected sites? There is no point in designating these things if we just think, well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a paper designation, but in practice, we'll just do whatever we want with them anyway. So all of our organisations see them as hugely important, backbone of a Scottish nature network. And then we need to be thinking in the wider countryside, what can we be doing to link those important places up?
Perfect. Thanks for that response. And I think we've probably just got time for one or two more questions. So again, Brian, how confident are we with evidence we have to make good climate change proof decisions for managing nature going forward? Are there any key gaps we need to look to address?
Yeah, I can kick that off, and then Bruce can add some thoughts. I mean, I think it's a good question from Brian. I think what you're trying to drive at is that we talk a lot about the fact that nature and climate should be tackled together, and that there's lots of shared solutions, and that nature can be a solution to the climate crisis. But there obviously are also some trade-offs, and mostly about how we manage our land, and kind of risks around delivering climate solutions in a way that actually ends up damaging nature. I think in terms of key issues to look at here, woodland expansion, forestry is certainly one. So obviously there's kind of massive increased ambition around tree planting in order to tackle climate and achieve net zero targets. That is kind of welcome, but there are risks around that, how that's going to be delivered. And if it's not along the lines of kind of right tree in the right place with a big focus on native woodland expansion, as we've highlighted throughout the presentation, then it's possible that it could actually end up having a kind of negative impact on biodiversity. So that's certainly an area where NGOs are kind of keeping a scrutiny over, and are going to be really interested in hoping to influence that to be delivered in a nature positive way, because there is an opportunity there to do more for nature and climate if it's done in the right way. Another area, actually just coming back to your questions around protected areas, Brian, that commitment obviously to protect 30% of Scotland's land by 2030 is massively welcome. From our perspective, a lot of that is going to be around quality as well as quantity of protected areas. So ensuring that the network's effectively managed and in good condition is going to be critical for making sure that it's delivered in a meaningful way. And actually, I think part of that is examining further what the impacts of climate change are going to be on the network, and how species and habitats in the network are going to potentially move around as a result of climate change, and building enough kind of flexibility into the network to make sure that it can cope with that change and do the best it can for nature. And I hope that's an area that Nature Scot and government and NGOs are kind of aligned on, wanting to make the network more effective and building from what we have. So I think that could be an area we could collectively do more research in and investigation into what's actually needed over the next decade.
Again, agree with absolutely everything Isabel said. So two maybe slightly conflicting things. I'll say there is a massive need to improve our data collation and use. To, like, I'm a firm believer in you can't manage what you don't measure. We don't do enough of that in Scotland. Therefore, it's hard to make better decisions because we're kind of doing it with one data arm tied behind our back. I've dropped into the chat the recent Scottish Biodiversity Information Forum review, which is a large report, and I really would recommend looking at the key findings. But in essence, no one can easily provide access or use all of the biodiversity data collated in Scotland. That's the top key message, and that's a problem. If we want to be tackling the nature and climate emergency, there is a bunch of proposals in there, and they're still pretty relevant. We've got a chance to, particularly with the new agricultural policy coming through, get better data collection from that as well. Very important. But let's not let data be completely the enemy of making progress. We still know what needs to happen. We need to be investing, I mean, whatever language you want to use, if you want to say investing in natural capital, improving ecosystems, helping nature. There are a lot of things we know we can do. A lot of relatively easy, quick wins. Our riparian zones in Scotland are ripe for investing, and the benefits that would bring for biodiversity, for society, for the economy. There's lots we can be getting on with, as well as improving our data.
Perfect, thanks for that. And I think we have one final question. If we have time for just one more. So this is from Lewis. Will the actions we have partially achieved make a significant contribution to helping nature, or do we have to fully meet the action to start seeing the noticeable benefits we're hoping for?
I can start, Bruce.
Yeah, on you go.
I think that's an absolutely brilliant question and a nice one to end on. I think that we would say every action taken to help improve nature does make a difference, and even if some actions are taken across all of the areas that we've highlighted today, that will make a massive amount of difference. But I suppose the kind of flip side of that is, when we developed this plan, we were clear that it's not completely comprehensive, and it's definitely not everything that's needed to halt and reverse biodiversity loss in Scotland. It was 11 actions that we felt were kind of deliverable over the next 5 years, 5-10 years, under the kind of current framework that we have in Scotland, and identified based on those kind of drivers of biodiversity loss that we were talking about earlier. So even if you delivered all of the actions we set out in the plan really well, it doesn't mean that we'll actually do enough to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, and there'll probably be other actions that are needed on top of it. We did see it kind of as a kick-starting process of the first things needed to get us on the road to nature's recovery. So I suppose it's a bit of a mixed answer, but all actions brilliant, great if we're making progress, but we do need to see a lot more happening. Bruce, I don't know if you would add anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a starter for 10 this, or a starter for 11. These are things that the policy environment in Scotland would allow us to do in the next 5 years, and things that could happen very quickly to kickstart our response to the nature emergency. There's definitely much more that needs done. Any progress in any of these areas is welcome and will help us. So yeah, there are some good things the Scottish Government's done, and we think we've sort of praised them for that, but let's be realistic about the amount we still have to do.